the senior curator with the Detroit Historical Society, says it right there. I am an admitted boat nerd. How many boat nerds we got here? Yeah, pretty sure. I get to be the curator for the Detroit Historical Museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and a collection of about 250,000 things that we have at the an undisclosed location, a private warehouse. The Dawson Great Lakes Museum being our maritime museum, it was the third of the maritime museums on the Great Lakes, the first one to be purpose-built for that. If you get the chance to get down there, it's still free. We're in the process of doing a whole new landscaping project. So you're going to see kind of a new outside of the museum. We redid the inside about 2013. So it's in pretty great shape. In fact, I was down there just Sunday night. Of course, November 10th, the anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. We, like 3 or 4 other museums around the Great Lakes, do a program on that evening. And ours is kind of neat because it's an international event. It involves, well, we get Lee Murdoch over there. Anybody who knows Lee's music, he puts on a nice show. And then we do a wreath ceremony that involves vessels from all of the government agencies that work on the river. So U.S. Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard, Port of Detroit, Port of Windsor, Michigan State Police, OPP, all of those organizations send somebody to our honor guard, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He loves getting his picture taken, and he's very, very good about it. But they also send vessels, and we've got this wonderful flotilla that comes down, including a helicopter that comes in from the Homeland Security folks. So it's a real nice wreath ceremony. We also then do a historical presentation afterwards. We've been doing it for 25 years. And it kind of brings it home. And it was really nice because November 10th, oddly enough for us, and I should knock on some wood around here someplace so I can find it, has been relatively pleasant. You know, the weather this year came the day afterwards. And it was, that was kind of our gales of November. Going to be talking about the shipwrecks. We're going to kind of go into the background of the boats that have been lost, kind of how many have been lost, why, where does the weather play into this, and some other factors. And then from a more positive standpoint, what do we learn from these things? I mean, as a historian who studied archaeology, anthropologists, all kinds of people can learn a lot about the Great Lakes from the shipwrecks. So, while shipwrecks are a bad thing, I'm a sailor. I like boats when they're on top of the water, okay? Shipwrecks still, there's something to be taken from them. So, it's one of my favorite pictures, the Truesdell, and it's in a gale, and it's taken water over the side. This would have been about 1940, and lots of vessels plying the waters at this time. There were probably 300 freighters of this type that were out there. Today we've only got about 60 that are running. They're much different design. We'll kind of look at that. But I've talked to a lot of guys that used to steer these boats, and they run into the stuff. They used to run into it all the time. And, it wasn't something they looked forward to, but many of them have said, I've been up in front steering, and I'll look back, and the only thing I see is a smokestack. So this is not an unusual picture. This is something these guys live with. What's that?
Did it sink at that point?
No, it's fine. They're made. The idea is to let the water roll off of them, and they're made that way. But you can only take so much of that. I mean, this is tons of water on top of the tons. So tough on the boats. As far as the gales of November, is November tough? Yeah, November's really tough. Don't forget October. We had some pretty stiff winds. There's some great pictures. You go to YouTube and look at Duluth at the end of October, and they were getting hammered. I mean, their breakwall was underwater, and the Coast Guard was going out in the ship channel and practicing their disaster rescue stuff, because this is, it was pretty tough. Obviously, beginning of the year, there aren't many boats out, so we're going to discount this and maybe even December. Oddly enough, or not oddly enough, in the spring you get some weather that gets kind of ugly, but this happens in October and November, and it happens for a pretty good reason. Real quickly, just a couple of facts. An incredible amount of water that we've got here, an incredible resource that I hope we remember to take care of. You know, as far as the surface area of the lakes, but bigger than that, almost 300,000 square miles in the watershed. I mean, this is an incredible ecosystem that we're dealing with. 20% of the world's fresh surface water. We need to take care of this. They're also different than what sailors deal with on the ocean. When they're out on the ocean, the wave moment is in fact much different. You know, if there's a big storm, you know, the waves may be 30, 40, 50 feet, but they're you know, usually, you know, long rise and a long fall. Whereas on the Great Lakes, because waves are designed by what happens, especially under them. You know, the deeper the water is, the bigger the waves are. The shallower it is, the shorter the waves are, so that they're much quicker in moment. And that's our boats are built to take that, but it can be really tough, real choppy. Anybody who's been out sailing or on a power boat in a storm on the Great Lakes will understand how choppy the waves can be. Shore proximity, a big thing. You know, out on the ocean, you get into a storm, you turn tail and you run. You could run 2 or 3 days before you hit something. In the Great Lakes, you turn tail and run, you got 2 or 3 hours. So these things are all taken into account. Shallow harbors, there aren't a lot of places to go, especially up the east side of Michigan, Lake Huron. There are very few places that a boat can go in safely. They had to build Harbor Beach just because of that massive harbor. Rivers requiring skill. The guys who steer the boats on the Great Lakes are some of the best pilots in the world. You know, because they're not only dealing with the Detroit River and the St. Clair River and the St. Mary's River, they're dealing with the Calumet. If you've ever seen how that snakes through Cleveland or the Cuyahoga through Cleveland or Calumet in Chicago, these guys are good. The frequent stops and primary cargoes really refer to how the sailors get taken care of and fed, and they get fed pretty well. You know, it sits in the middle of the continent. The guys in Duluth are really proud of the fact that they're 2,000 miles from saltwater. You know, if you wind your way through to get to almost the middle of the continent, and if you're through Chicago, you can match yourself into the Mississippi system. It's pretty impressive, but this time of year, as the weather is changing, you know, you've got these big Alberta clippers, or I hear it's coming from Siberia this week. You know, it's just coming over the poles and sweeping into the lakes. You've also got this warm air, this warm, dry air that can come out of the west. And depending on the time of the year, the end of the hurricane season, you've got this moist, warm air coming out of the south. And very often these things are fighting each other. In fact, if we talk about the night that happened to the Fitzgerald, you know, this is basically what happened. This stuff all met right there. You know, it just peeled in together. There were 3 different weather systems that were coming at different speeds and just basically created a cyclone. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as far as what the weather was happening. Real quickly, the vessels that we've had to deal with. I throw this up to show the sailing ships of European design and American design, and then we get passenger boats, bulk carriers, and the bulk carriers kind of switch over to self-unloaders, but I don't want to forget the canoes. You know, people have been navigating the Great Lakes for hundreds of years before we started building big European-style boats. And those guys were in some pretty neat crafts. You know, this is not something I'd want to take out except on a really quiet day. But this is just off the Harson's Island. This guy came over and his wife came over from Walpole Island. They found vessels like this in Walled Lake. I mean, these things are around. And were important, but they weren't the best way to go. The better way to go was this, you know, the big birch bark canoes. You could build them just about anywhere if you had the skills. You could take them just about anywhere. They do 2 or 3 inches unless you and they carry 3 tons, 4 tons of furs. These are pretty impressive vessels. Or you could build them small. And if you ran them up on a rock, you could fix them. Pull over, there's, you know, get the tar and the spruce and what you need. And they beautifully designed boats, but you know, you get them offshore in a big blow. Anybody who's been in a canoe in a serious wave action, it's pretty scary. And so I'm sure that thousands of these guys were lost. I threw this picture in just to show the end of the day for the guys in the Voyager camps. You know, these guys have been paddling for 10 or 12 hours and they're eating a little pemmican and smoking a pipe and going to bed. The first European vessel, the Griffin. If we're talking shipwrecks, you got to start here. I think that this is pretty much what it looked like. Bob McGreevy's done a lot of research. He just painted this last year. or I guess earlier this year. And this is essentially what happened. So what did happen? First shipwreck of the Great Lakes. We send a boat out. He leaves from Black Rock, sails over into Green Bay. He's got some furs waiting for him. This is LaSalle, who's the explorer at this point. He's got some furs waiting for him. He's going to make himself rich. And since that's going to make him rich, he's sailing off down to this area here to click over to the Mississippi to find the head of the Mississippi. He's the guy that named the falls in Minnesota, and then he headed down the Mississippi to find the Gulf. I mean, he's off on a massive trip. So he sends his second in command back with the boat, and massive storm comes in, it disappears, and we don't really know what the story is. People have found it about every 20 years. The latest, it first appeared over here and was real convincingly done. The archaeologists from France came over. That wasn't it. Found up in the Manitous, found in the Chenaux, and Steve Liebert has been digging at it over in Lake Michigan for a while. He's sure he's found it. Nobody else is sure he's found it. In fact, most people are pretty sure he didn't find it. Bob McGreevy, who's done some really serious research recently, is pretty sure it's probably over near St. Helens Island, based on Native American accounts of seeing a vessel in distress, and it was the only one on the lake, so it's really hard to confuse it. But we'll find. Stay tuned. That will come up. As far as vessels lost, we start with the very most simple ones, the bateaux that were sailed up and down the lakes, smaller lakes, rivers. This would have been something that would have been around Detroit, moving sand, moving whatever needed grain and that kind of thing. Basically a shoebox, real easy to build, and we know there are some of these on the bottom of Lake St. Clair. The military came in. British started building more vessels. The Welcome was built up at Mackinac, but served down in Detroit. They did make a replica of it. Some of you might have seen it up at Mackinac. It was there for a while. It's now moved over to Traverse City and refurbished, but it really wasn't built very well in the first place, so it's in pretty bad shape. They're thinking of sinking it off of Mackinac City, kind of as a dive site. I fear that's what's going to happen with that. And we really didn't get any of the big, grand age of sail vessels, except the ones that served during the War of 1812. This would have been down at Malden, Amherstburg. And the Americans built the same kind of thing over in Lake Erie. They got together, they shot each other up, and really the great age of sail went away really pretty quickly. Because what we did is adapted vessels like this. Schooner, if I back up, this kind of vessel takes at least 120 men to run, all right? This kind of vessel takes about 5. So from a commercial standpoint, this can be built pretty easily and manned very easily, and nobody's leaving the deck. On those other vessels with the square sails, you gotta send guys aloft. There's gonna be trouble in bad weather. These can mostly be managed from the deck, and again, small crews, mostly families. At one time, geez, the 1880s, 1870s, there would have been 3,000 of these, 2,000 of these working the lakes. So anywhere you were, you would have seen these beautiful fluffs of white out on the lake moving around. And of course, because of that, we've lost many hundreds of them. Boats like this, the big passenger steamers of the first palace steamer era, very lightly built. Many of these suffered either fires, or in this case, it was run into by a very small schooner. Because they were built so light, that schooner hit it right about here and pierced it almost halfway through. Vessel sank very quickly. About 180 people died over near Chicago. We had built bigger and bigger boats. The city of Detroit, fortunately, didn't go down. One of its compatriots, the city of Cleveland 3, had a pretty serious accident. This boat, the Marquette and Bessemer 2, I'll bring back, but these were the rail car ferries. They ran on Lake Michigan, they ran on Lake Erie, and several of these big vessels were lost in storms. Of course, the Edmund Fitzgerald, a beautiful straight decker, doesn't have a self-unloading device, nice, clean, clear deck for loading ore and emptying ore. The self-unloaders, of course, the equipment added to get the ore or stone or whatever you're carrying out of the hull. Bradley, lost. American Spirit, fortunately, we haven't lost any of the 1,000-footers. And I kind of threw this in here just to compare the freeboard. You know, we were looking at first picture of the Truesdale where the area between the water and the deck was about as much as we've got here. You know, these things are just huge floating warehouses, and you've got almost a story and a half there, maybe even two, between the water. So these are pretty safe boats. They also carry really fancy life-saving gear. Of course, the latest in technologies as far as weather radar, radio, all of the communications gear you need. And they do something that they didn't do in the old days. They stay in harbor if weather's getting bad. You know, right up through the age of the Fitzgerald, those guys were, you know, iron sailors. They went out into weather that maybe they shouldn't have. You know, it was a matter of moving the product, keeping it moving. These guys are told, the skippers, you know, if you think there's bad weather, you shouldn't be out there, don't go. One of the latest developments is the kind of the articulated tug barge. This is the barge. There's actually a second vessel, a tugboat. It's tucked in the back of it. They've often repurposed old freighters, pulled the engines out, put in a V in the back, and then they've got a tug that comes in. Really efficient. Whereas a freighter of this type has to carry about 28 or 30 guys as far as, and women, as far as staff. The crews on these can be as low as 15. So that they're saving a lot of money. It's also real efficient. While you're loading the barge, the tug can pull out and go get refueled. If the engine dies, you put another tug in the back of it. It's really quite an efficient system. They're not as pretty, but they certainly work. So that's what's down there. If we're talking gales, let's look at a couple of storms. You may have heard of a couple of these, but there's so many that were devastating. Starting as early as 35. You know, we've got 17 ships stranded and 9 sunk with all hands. We don't know the loss of life. The Seiche of 1844, I just did a presentation on this. This was a thing on Lake Erie where the wind had been blowing out of the northeast for 4 or 5 days. All the water was down at the far end near Monroe, and when the wind changed direction, it changed to exactly the opposite direction and blew a hurricane, and blew all that water in Monroe back up into Buffalo, flooded Buffalo 22 feet, destroyed a bunch of vessels. 75 people died in town, 50 people out on the lake, and canal boats were scattered a mile inland. These are storms you don't usually hear about. In fact, we tried to find somebody in Buffalo that talked about this, and there wasn't anybody. I had to do it myself. 150 years ago, you know, the bad year, 138 vessels lost over the course of the year, but the storm in November, and again, we're talking November, October, you know, 97 vessels stranded, 35 total losses. And these are storms you don't hear about. 93, 54 lives lost. 1905, we're going to touch on 1905 a little bit later. 17 stranded, 32 men gone. Storm of 1913 is kind of the big one because 43 vessels were stranded, 13 lost, but a massive loss of life, 244 people in that one storm. In November, again, we're in November, a little October. Here's another November 11th. Armistice Day storm of 1940. Black Friday was a big one. I mean, there's a bunch of incidents where the weather comes through at the end of the year and gets real ugly. Again, Bradley, Daniel Morell, Edmund Fitzgerald, all in that November's time. So gales in November is not something that Gordon Lightfoot made up. How many shipwrecks? Easy to say, over 3,000. David Swayze, if you go to his website, I think it's hosted by the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. They host his database of shipwrecks, and he's guessing right about there. He may have added a couple since. But you'll also go places and people will say 10,000. Which brings about the question, what's a shipwreck? Okay. Very first shipwreck on the Upper Lakes, our first other than the Griffin, our very first steamboat, the Walk on the Water, launched in 1818, operated for 3 years very successfully from Black Rock near Buffalo over to Detroit, occasionally up to Mackinac. I think once it got to Green Bay. Left in 1821, late October, I think, and left Buffalo. Here's the Buffalo Lighthouse, one of the first on the lakes, and was on its way to Dunkirk, up the shore, the American shore of Lake Erie. Boat could do about 7 knots. ran into a 30-knot wind on its nose. 30-knot wind winds over 7 knots. It basically blew itself back to Buffalo. The captain had dropped the anchors. He had 3 anchors down, and he's just dragging them across the sand bottom. And finally, it kind of just came up on the beach. There's a couple of people had recorded this in letters, and it basically came up and bumped, and then bumped harder, then bumped one more time, and it didn't move. And this is pretty accurate. This is a painting commissioned by a woman, Mary Palmer, who was the wife of Thomas Palmer, who's the uncle of the guy who donated Palmer Park, you know, the Detroit family. And Mary had been on the boat, and in fact, she was on the first cruise, and she was on the last cruise. She hired the guy who painted this, and she got the engineer. She and the engineer got off into the boat and went and got the lighthouse keeper, woke him up, said, start the fire, let's go save some people. And they were able to get everybody off. Nobody died. They went back and got the engines the next year. The engines are the most expensive part of the boat. The rest of it basically fell apart over the winter, and so is that a shipwreck. You know, nobody died, most of the equipment was saved. Does that really count? The Mataafa, said we'd talk about 1905. They call it the Mataafa storm. It actually grounded several boats up off of Duluth. Mataafa had left Duluth, sailed out, and the skipper decided that this was a bad idea. We're not going to make it. So he made it. He turned. Toughest part is turning the boat and getting back. And if you've been to Duluth, the ship channel is a concrete wall. Probably 2 boats wide, but you only want to go in 1 boat at a time. And so they were coming in with a terrible stern wind and almost made the entrance. At the last minute, a wave picked them up, turned them sideways, slammed them into the walls. The boat broke in half as it sat there. And the whole town of Duluth is watching as the guys up in front, they've got a stove and they're able to keep warm. The guys in back, as the stern sunk, the boilers went out. They had no way to stay warm, and 9 guys froze on the back end of the boat as the rest of the city watched. Really painful, real ugly. A lot of people in Duluth, you know, either remember or talk about the Mataafa storm. But, you know, next spring they raised the boat, they put it back to work. Here it is rigged up to carry cars from McCarthy. You know, it's probably a picture taken near Detroit. You know, is that a shipwreck? So the question is, you know, do they have to be on the bottom and have lost a lot of people? Can they be just driven up against the walls in Duluth and that counts as a shipwreck? If you hear 10,000 and you can't justify it with Dave Swayze's 4,700, that's probably where that lies. I mentioned this one, the Marquette and Bessemer II, which sailed between Conneaut and Port Colborne, carrying railroad cars, and this boat disappeared in a storm. Massive vessel, Lake Erie storm, went down, nobody has found it. This is a big boat, and Lake Erie's a relatively shallow lake. Now, it did sink at the deep end, but they've never been able to find this boat, and there's speculation as to why. I'll touch on that in a few minutes, but you know, no survivors here. Of course, the Bradley went down. There were 2 survivors. One of the guys is still making the rounds. We were talking about survivors before, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but Frank Mays. Frank survived, and he's 93 years old, and we had him up for a program last year, and Frank says, you know, I've got my all my tickets and everything's all set, and you know, I'm clear security, no problem. I'm renting a car, let me know where I need to be. For a 93-year-old, he's pretty spry. And somebody asked him at the end of the presentation, do you ever have any regrets about being one of the 2 survivors? He said, no, I know people do that. I understand it, I get it, but you know, I survived. I was lucky, and I've made every day since then a wonderful day. You know, that's a great thing. The Morel went down, and they only had 1 survivor, and he just died about a year and a half ago, but he didn't talk about his experiences for 65 years. I'm sorry, till he was 65, and then he kind of came out and started doing oral histories and wrote a book and that kind of thing. So very, very different experiences for people who survived these things. And then the Fitz, 29 guys, no survivors, no final messages. There's lots of suggestions as to what happened. Shifting cargo. One of the suggestions was there's a spot back here where it was built to run coal, and they switched it to oil. And there's usually a coal bunker back here, and they just covered it in a 1/4 inch steel. And one of the engineers who had built the boat said it should have been at least a 1/2 inch, and I would have made it an inch, but I'm not second guessing. He just thinks they might have gotten hit with a big wave and it just punched that in, and that contributed. I think there's probably 4 dozen books out there about why the Fitz sunk, and probably 10 or 12 good reasons why people think it sank, and I'd say it was probably 3 of them. You know, pick your favorite 3 reasons, because it's not one thing that'll sink a boat that big. It's going to be a number of them. The story of the Fitz, well documented. You know, they left here on November 9th down at Duluth. The Arthur Anderson left about the same time out of 2 harbors, and they basically sailed up together. The predictions were not good. You know, the weather was supposed to be coming out of here, so they stayed kind of to the north instead of cutting south here. They stayed up to the north, and then they made their turn, and they were kind of running before it, or at least that's what they hoped was going to happen. The winds, we talked about cyclonic winds earlier. You know, here over at Standards Rock, it's 50 miles out of the dead west. We got 19 miles here at the Sioux, blowing kind of from the southwest, 44 straight out of the south, and 20 coming in from the southeast. So really what's happening at this time is there's a cyclone going on, and it's stirring things up. Wind is what makes waves happen. And if you've got these kind of winds and they're fighting each other, you're getting into some really confused seas, and probably some very big seas. There was a question, especially Captain McSorley thought that the Fitzgerald was too close to a reef that is right up in here. And the reef's 35 feet underwater, and the boat's only drawing 22 feet. But if you're running in 30-foot waves, you know, you're going down an extra 15 feet lower than you think you are. If you're running in 40-foot waves, it's an extra 20 feet down. And that would have put the Fitz on top of that. If you had actually done it, that would have put it on top of that rock and punched a hole in the bottom. There isn't any evidence of that. Of course, people have only been down on the wreck a couple of times. You know, they kept pumping along, as the skipper said, you know, we're going along like an old shoe, but they went into a storm, a white squall, kind of right around here, passing snowstorm, and when they came out of the snowstorm, the Anderson didn't see him anymore. That was pretty much the end of it, and McSorley couldn't believe that a boat of that size would have sunk. He just figured he lost it somehow, and he kept on going to Whitefish Bay, and it wasn't until he got down here and, you know, called the Coast Guard and said, has anybody seen the Fitz? And they're saying, no, they should have been here, shouldn't they? And he said, yeah, and he explained the story, and the Coast Guard said, can you turn around and go find him? There's a recording of this. You can feel him going, my heavens. Thinking of his cruise, thinking of his boat, and he said, yeah, we'll do it if you think that's what we need to do. William Clay Ford was down here too, and that's kind of why we celebrate the things. We've got the Pilot House, and those guys were sitting at dinner. They were finishing up dinner at anchor, safe, and they up anchored and went out to try to find him. There were 2 or 3 other saltwater vessels out there, and eventually the Coast Guard sent some folks, but you know, by then it was too late. So that's, you know, what happened to the Fitz. Your best guess. I'm sure there's books upstairs you can read that'll add to the fuel. So the good side of this is that these things can become tools for people like me. Divers have been looking for them for a long time, and the cold water of the Great Lakes is a wonderful way to save that stuff. And they're pretty easy to find, sometimes. This is down in Indiana Dunes, wreck of an old schooner, probably 1850s, and you're just walking along the beach, you're gonna find it. The high water this year has turned over all kinds of these things. The state archaeologist who's based out of Alpena, has been going out, people have been calling him, things have been washing up, He's been all over the state because these things will get uncovered in a storm, or just, you know, some gentle washing. Boats have been popping, the hulls, the wrecks, what's left of a boat have been turning up all over the place. They also, over the last couple of years, the equipment to find these things has been getting better. But sometimes it's just as easy. This is over in Tobermory, Big Tub Harbor. And this is about 5 or 6 feet down, depending on the water levels. And you can just kayak over the top of it, see what a schooner looked like, see how it was built. Beautifully preserved shipwreck. Sometimes if you're a shipwreck searcher, you're gonna have to go to the library, start looking through old newspapers. Here's one that talks about the collision between the Jack and the Norman. And within this lay the clues you probably want. It went down opposite Middle Island, and it went down in 300 feet of water. So that gives you an idea. You know, opposite Middle Island is probably, depending on the geography, you know, between one point and another, and in 300 feet you go down with your depth finder and you know pretty much where you want to start looking. Sometimes you go back to the diaries, the log books. This is the log from the vessel that ran into the Lady Elgin, the Augusta. It's not the same year, but it was a little two-masted wood lumber schooner and sailed from Buffalo around to Wisconsin and back a lot of times. It's on Lake Erie. I could pretty well point out where the guy writes this down, where he's coming across a sunken schooner, the mastheads are sticking above the water, and if you know where, you know, if you know what you're looking for, and you basically know where he is, you can go out and start to look for it. Charts help a lot, especially in shallow water. These little football things represent wrecks, so you can go look there. And this is, I mean, this is a relatively shallow area. If you really wanted to look for those wrecks, this is Harson's Island, Russell's Island. Harson's Island's right next to it, so right in our neighborhood. Or Google Earth, kind of cool. You know, you can go up and you can find these things on the charts and just look at them. Here's one that we found. This is just off Grosse Pointe, Patterson Park and Grosse Pointe Park. And you know, you can find this, and then we went down and dove on that. It's in about 6 feet of water. I can dive that. You know, and it basically has been rubbed off by ice and stuff. It's the bottom timbers of the ship, but it's kind of cool. I mean, it's not a quarter mile offshore, and if you're interested in going shipwreck hunting, you can do it in your own backyard. This is an interesting story, the mystery of the Lockwood. Lockwood sank in Lake Erie. Everybody was saved. They knew right where it was. The Lake Survey Office and the Coast Guard both went out and put buoys on it. They took all the lat longes back when it went down. And about 4 years ago, a group of guys out of Cleveland, Cleveland Underwater Explorers, CLUE, they wanted to go find it. And they had all the information. They went out, they had lat longe and the whole darn thing. They went out and looked over, and they couldn't find a darn thing. And they looked and they looked and they looked, and they finally saw something sticking out of the bottom that looked like that. But it was the end of the year, so they had to call it quits. They went back, did their research again. They were sure it should be there. Went back the next year with a magnetometer and I think some ground penetrating radar, and darn it, the boat is there. It's just because of the aqueous nature of Lake Erie, there are portions of Lake Erie that are quicksand. And that boat has just sunk right down into the bottom of the lake and disappeared. Which I think may be what happened to the Marquette and Bessemer that we talked about before. Big boat, and they can't find it with the equipment that we've got. Could be the same thing that happened to the Lockwood. So the technologies are getting better. You know, in the old days, if you wanted to find a shipwreck, you got a buddy and you hung a chain and some line over the back, and you went back and forth and you hoped you snagged something. And if you snagged something, then you went down and take a look at it. That's kind of, it takes some time and some trust. They've now got some wonderfully, relatively inexpensive sonar equipment. And shoot, this picture is probably 15 years old. I need to upgrade it because it's all, instead of going into this box, it's going into your laptop, and you can record the whole thing. And you know, the sonar fish goes down off of a reel. That's the same. It just plugs into a much more advanced computer system. And you tow it behind you. Now this would be probably a video camera. Most of the guys I know that do this put a video camera down first, but then the sonar just kind of passes right over, and you get a nice view once you get there. You may have an idea where the boat is, but usually what happens is you'll sector off a piece of your chart, and you'll do what they call cutting the lawn. You just go back and forth until you find something. And this guy probably on the next pass is going to run across that, and he'll get what he's been looking for all day, or maybe all week, or maybe all month, or maybe all year. And this is usually what it looks like, or what it used to look like with that equipment. You know, this is the wreck the guy was looking for. This is a wreck the guy may not have been looking for. What's that anomaly there? Interesting to see. You're talking probably 800 feet, 1,000 feet wide. Technology's getting better every year. In fact, as it gets better, when you get a good side scan, and I think this is a schooner that's been in the, or a collision that's been in the news lately. There's two vessels that people thought were up in the Mackinac Straits, and they're finding them now over Skilligalee. Brendan Baylod and I forget the other jet's name. Think they just found this wreck over in Skilligalee, but this was a side scan done of something similar, and you know, with something like that, you can count the number of hatches, you can count how many the masts are, where the masts may have fallen overboard, how long the vessel is. Without anybody going in the water, you may actually be able to put a name on this boat. So that's kind of neat how the technology's taking it. Not that the guys who like diving will stop at that. The part they're into is, you know, getting in the boat or getting in the gear and going down underneath and seeing it live. This is the way you used to have to do it. Fairly dangerous occupation at the time. It's gotten a whole lot easier. Of course, scuba gear developed during World War II, and then in the 60s and 70s, it was really quite a fad. There were a lot of people into it. Not so many people now, which is kind of too bad. This person's using just a regular, you know, single tank scuba thing. Easy to get to 100 feet, pretty easy to get to 150 feet. People in that kind of gear can do up to 200, but they better be good. And because that was such a limiting factor, divers have been working to increase that depth. And they've now got rigs that they call technical diving, or gas mix diving, or just the hard stuff. These guys actually mix their gases as they go down farther. The problem is, as you get down farther, you have to change the amount of nitrogen and helium and oxygen in your bloodstream, or you're going to start doing damage to your innards. And so these guys actually have a whole formula where they can go down and they'll adjust. They've got computers on their wrists and all these things that they will adjust these things going down. And technical divers can get down to about 500 feet. In fact, they've been to the FITS, so it's 530. This is pretty tough diving. This is brave stuff. I've talked to these guys. It gets darker as you go. You start getting more and more paranoid the farther you get down, so you're looking at your computer every 10 seconds. Your eyes start wandering in different directions. You gotta really wanna go down there, because you're gonna take probably, on a 500-foot dive, you probably take 15 minutes to get to the wreck. You probably have about 10 minutes on the wreck, and then you're gonna spend 2 hours decompressing, slowly coming up your anchor line, you know, a few feet at a time, so you don't get the bends. You gotta really wanna do this stuff. And I know guys that do this. This is great. I'm glad they do. It certainly is kind of a new frontier. People are searching it out. People like me who, you know, 10 or 15 feet is about as deep as we like doing. There's other ways of going. This is the suit that they used on the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's obviously a hard cast suit. Very, very, no, it has motion. It's not very flexible. But it's got cameras and lights and all the things they needed to cut the bell off of the Fitzgerald and bring it up and put another bell down there with all the names on it. So this is an option. This is an expensive option, which really goes back to that first hard hat diver I showed you. Kind of tough. I like this one. You got enough money, a few $1,000,000, you can buy yourself a sub, put some beer in the fridge, go down, look around. These guys can go down to several 100,000 feet, depending on what you purchase. It's not a bad way to go, but it's really expensive. This kind of thing is not, and this is really kind of a lot of fun. This is a remotely operated vehicle, ROVs, and this one's down in the Titanic, so it's down a long way, And these kind of things are being used all the time. The prices on these have fallen. They've got lights, they've got cameras. Some of them actually have arms that you can articulate. Again, they're tethered to the surface, so all of the information is coming to people up on the surface. We're controlling them. Nobody's in the water. The chances of somebody dying is relatively minimal. And the best part is, we've all seen in these STEM classes, grade schools, high schools, kids are making robots. They get together and fight each other. What they're doing in a bunch of places, up in Traverse City, there's a couple of programs, and I know around the lakes, this is what you're building. They're building these remotely operated vehicles in class, a lot of it out of PVC pipe, and just gluing it together, and then, of course, the computers and stuff are the expensive part. But kids are building these for, under $100 and going out and doing their own diving and searching and having fun, looking for stuff on the bottom of Grand Traverse Bay. It's a neat way to go, and it's a whole lot less expensive way to go, and nobody's in the water. So that's pretty cool. Once you've found a wreck, there's kind of an obligation to document it as quickly as possible. Now, divers have been very careful about handing out the locations of new wrecks that they find. They're very protective of these, and I can't blame them, because sometimes they'll spend 10, 20 years looking for certain wrecks and trying to identify them. And when they find them, they'd like to have the joy of being the first on the deck, being the first to do the searching, and being the first to release that to the press and letting people know. But doing the documentation is something they don't mind. Again, it doesn't have to necessarily be done down on the bottom. You can do it by sending cameras over and then stitching it together into a photo menage there. And you can get a pretty good idea of what a vessel looks like just using that ROV and putting this stuff together. They still do, and especially if they're relatively shallow, regular transects the same way an archaeologist would do a village, an old village on land. They're doing this kind of thing underwater. You run a basic baseline and then start working from there. Conservation is something we've been really kind of emphasizing with wrecks. This is up at Alpena. Anybody been up to the NOAA facility up in Alpena? Great facility. This is actually the lobby out here. So when you walk in, you're looking into the conservation lab. In the old days, divers used to bring stuff all the time off the wrecks. It's what they did. It's why they went diving. Bring up some china, bring up the steering wheel, put something on your mantelpiece. That's in the 60s and 70s. That's why you dove. And then we realized that when you start moving stuff around or taking stuff off a boat, you're ruining an archaeological site. And it really becomes a problem. And there's been some push and pull in the dive community over 50 years, but most of the divers I know today are on board with the science. They want to preserve these artifacts, record them. Most of them are photographers now. They got wonderful, high definition cameras that they take down, record stuff as quickly as they can, because of course, zebra mussels have become a huge problem. Some of these guys that did photography back in the 70s and 80s, they're going back to these wrecks and they're almost unrecognizable. There's so many zebra mussels on them, coating everything you can. You don't see dead eyes, you don't see any of the cleats. All of this stuff has been covered. In fact, with steel ships, the zebra mussels, their excrement is a huge problem. Doesn't affect the wood vessels as much, but the mussels, they take in all the stuff, and when they let some stuff out, it's disintegrating the steel. And those vessels, especially with the weight of the mussels, they're starting to collapse. I've talked to some divers that were having problems with that. Wood vessels not so bad, but the steel vessel is a problem. Things that are brought up or things that were brought up years ago, we do try to do conservation on them. Everything's a little bit different. The steel, the copper, the wood, ceramics are probably the most stable. Highly underpaid interns do this, to get their degrees. The reason that we really don't bring stuff up is probably best defined by the story of the Alvin Clark. The Alvin Clark, John Clark, Clark Street in Detroit. John Clark had a dry dock. He built this boat to bring salt from Buffalo because he had a fish business and he needed to salt his fish in Detroit. He didn't realize we were sitting on a pile of salt. So he's importing salt, coal to Newcastle. He had this boat for a while, sold it to some folks in Chicago, and then they sold it to some folks up in Green Bay. and it used to run wood, supposedly legally, from Green Bay down to Chicago, and then hopefully bring back a cargo of some kind of provisions that they can make money on. In this particular voyage in 1864, into the Civil War era, they couldn't get a deadhead cargo, so they're coming back empty. They figure, let's dry out the hold, so they got all the hatch covers off. They get into Green Bay and not paying attention. There's they get hit by a squall, rolls the boat over, hatches are open, fills the boat, sinks in minutes. 3 of the 5 guys on board are lost. The boat goes down. Nobody really recorded when it went down. Enter Frank Hoffman. Actually, enter Frank Hoffman's buddies, who are fishermen, commercial fishermen. They just bought a new net. They're dragging the net behind the boat. The net gets hung up on something. Frank knows how to dive. He owns a bar, but he learned how to scuba dive. We're in Marinette, Wisconsin right now. He goes out, scuba dives down to find their net. He finds the net attached to a schooner, beautifully intact schooner. Master's still standing, some of the rigging's still there. The boat itself looks like it just kind of dropped to the bottom, having been just sailed. And he gets all the scuba guys excited, and they all come out and they pump out tons of silt. They get cables under it, they lift it up. Here's a picture of it being brought to the surface. Luckily, Marinette is the home of Marinette Marine, so they've got all the barges and cranes and everything they need to bring it up. They've taken the mast out at this point to make it easy. They're lifting the boat up. They put some pumps in it. They pump it out. It floats like the day it went down. And it just was in spectacular shape. In fact, I've got a couple of pictures. They turned it in. They're expecting to make it into a maritime museum. The biggest problem was Marinette's a long way from anywhere. You're trying to open a museum. Wasn't so good, but look at the shape that the boat is in. I mean, you could almost take the vessel out and sail it the way it was. And this was recognized. Here's Howard Chappell from the Smithsonian, kind of the dean of maritime historians, and he said, this is a great treasure. This is more important than any treasure ship, any Spanish galleon. We're able to look at the way people lived back then, how they built their boats, how they put their kit together to go out sailing, what they were eating with. Just a wonderful treasure. The biggest problem was Frank spent all his money getting the boat out of the water. Triple mortgaged the bar. And unfortunately, if you pull a boat up, it starts to go to rot. And there was no way, they hadn't figured out how to preserve it. This is back in the 70s, late 70s, they over in I think it was Norway, they found that Viking ship, and they had brought it up, and they had built a building, and they were spraying it to keep it wet until they figured out what to do. Frank didn't have that option, and so little by little he got kicked out of one yard and kicked out of another yard, and the boat just broke in half. And he's being chased by the banks for money, and in fact, in the middle of the night, he called a former curator at the Dawson and said, John, you got a truck? Yeah. Can you come tomorrow? Yeah. And John Polsek drove over there with a van and loaded as much stuff as he could get in the dark of night, with his license plate covered, and he snuck it back to Detroit. And I didn't know we had it. It was sat there in boxes for 25 years. Until John retired, and we got him back to tell us what was there. And I said, John, what are all these boxes? He said, that's the last of the Alvin Clark. Because really, the Frank moved to Florida, broken man. He tried to burn the boat just to get rid of it. And then when the fire department showed up, he held them off with a shotgun. I mean, and these are his friends. I mean, Marinette's not a big town. He knows all these guys. They talked him down, but he was a broken man. It busted him. Went to Florida and died there, and the boat fell apart. This is where that beautiful capstan was. There's the capstan right there. Boat just collapsed. They ended up bulldozing it into dump trucks and taking it to the landfill.
Better to leave it under there for scuba divers to look at.
So what do you think happened? They passed laws. Laws got passed that said you leave this stuff on the bottom. Ronald Reagan signed the Bottomlands Act, and all of the states passed laws that said, you leave a boat on the bottom and you leave everything on it on the bottom. So while this is a horrible tragedy for the Alvin Clark, for Frank Hoffman, it really, really changed the way we look at our bottomlands and our shipwrecks. And now we're kind of leading the way, as far as Michigan in particular, leading the way to this kind of preservation. Michigan's got 15 underwater preserves. In fact, this one I need to redraw it. It comes up to about here. This is the Alpena Thunder Bay Preserve. And there's some great stuff being done. And some of these are real accessible. Over along here, they've done a wonderful thing where they've got kind of a shipwreck tour you can do in a kayak. You know, these are wrecks that are 10 or 15 feet underwater. You can see them real easily. You know, up here, a little less accessible, but certainly we're kind of leading the way. Ohio was going to get one over by the Erie Islands, and the people who owned the property along the shoreline got scared off, and they nullified it. They're trying to get one over here in Pennsylvania, trying to get one in this area, and the folks in Wisconsin are trying to get one up in this area here, and I think they're going to be successful. They were almost there. And then political winds changed, and then they weren't there at all, and then political winds have changed again, and now I think they may get it. So this is the kind of thing they're doing. We're also, new approach to education. This is a wonderful program the Pride of Michigan run out of Mount Clemens. There are a couple of Sea Scout boats in the Detroit area. There's one in Port Huron, the Gray Fox. So these guys actually bring young cadets as part of the Navy Sea Cadet program. They bring them in, and they not only teach them how to yes sir and no sir, they're really, really good at that, but how to drive the boat. Once this boat leaves the dock, the teenagers are in charge of it. You know, there's a captain on board, and there's a mate and an engineer, but the youngsters are in charge of the boat, and they're off to do some really cool stuff. They teach them to dive, and then they teach them archaeology, and then they teach them limnology and bathymetry. These guys have found anaerobic sinkholes off Alpena. They've been searching waterfalls under the Straits of Mackinac. They've been looking at elk herding. Middle of Lake Huron used to be above water. And the way they captured elk was the same way we captured mustangs out west. You know, they kind of drove them in this, they did it with boulders. Elks don't like stepping over
These
boulders.
people found those walls?
These kids are finding this stuff. They're working with adults.
Who do that sort of thing?
Yeah, Woods Hole, Michigan State, University of Michigan, the Scripps Oceanographic Institute will rent this boat, and they'll go out and do some of these surveys. And it's a really wonderful program, not only because it's doing great archaeology, but it's teaching another generation of people to do this. And in their spare time, they go looking at shipwrecks. They have fun doing that. The Dawson Museum, we support Great Lakes history in all the possible way we can, besides putting in wonderful exhibits about this kind of stuff. Yeah.
When you were talking about the Fitzgerald sinking, my wife and I were at Dawson's when the captain was still alive.
Don Erickson.
Ford.
Yep.
We spoke to him. He actually autographed something for us there.
Oh, that's good.
I still have it. I forgot.
Don Erickson was
or
the skipper of the William Clay Ford. In fact, I think I've got a picture here. Let's go through a couple. The William Clay Ford's pilot house is on there. And Don Erickson, who was the skipper the night the Fitz went down and took the boat out into the storm, would come down and sit in his pilot's chair, his captain's chair, and talk to people.
Yeah.
And there's actually a really wonderful YouTube video. If you can probably search for Anderson or William Clay Ford or Dawson Museum or Great Lakes Maritime Institute. We're all kind of involved in that. And we've got the Fitzgerald anchor. This is an anchor lost in the fairway just west of Belle Isle. It's a place where ships can drop anchor and wait out a storm or something like that. In this case, it was going downbound, and it was late in the season, and the Coast Guard had pulled all the buoys. And the skipper just didn't feel like navigating at night without the buoys, so he just turned and dropped anchor. And when they brought up the anchor chain the next day, the master link had broken and the anchor remained at the bottom after the Fitz was lost. Some diver friends of ours and some people who own barges and cranes and stuff helped us go out and find it and raise it up and restore it and get it in place. And in fact, with our new landscaping project, it's moving. This was kind of off to the side, where you couldn't really see it very well. We've moved it over where it's just to be visible from the road, a lot more accessible. So that's the kind of thing we do. Now, just wrapping up with a couple of fun stories, if you'll pardon me. We got a call a few, now it was 2011, that the police divers who do their training in the river, tough gig, you know, they're basically, visibility can maybe anywhere from 6 feet to nothing, and they're down there trying to find stuff, and there's a particular reef right in this area here called Chicken Bone Reef, and there's a number of suggestions as to why it's called that, but they dove there for many years, and they found 5 British cannons that were down there. And the idea, I think, was the fort, the old fort used to sit here, and there was a little road off the bluff, and we think they dragged them out there in the winter as the Americans are coming in 1796. The British are moving down to Malden at Fort Amherstburg, and they've got these old 4-pounders that don't work anymore. The British Army doesn't want them anymore. They're going to 3, 6, 9, and 12s, and this 4 was kind of anomalous. Besides, they were used in the Napoleonic Wars on the continent. They came over here for the Revolutionary War. By the time they got to Detroit, they were blown out. They were shot. They could make big noise, scare Indian, but that was about as much as they could do. So they just decided, instead of letting the Americans have them, let's just drop them in the river. They pulled them out on the ice, we're guessing, based on kind of how they ended up on the bottom. And it really doesn't look like this, okay? It looks more like that. They found a 6th one. This is kind of fun. It was the first one I was involved with, and here's the barrel. You know, again, we're covered in zebra and quagga mussels. But this is kind of a cool thing, and the police department guys just took charge of it. They did some, bottom scanning, so I could see from the scan exactly where it was sitting. This is good archaeology. They got the compass points and did some basic measurements, so I knew what they were bringing up. And then they had a blast. They got, look at all the TV cameras that are lined up along here. This went worldwide. They went down. They wrapped it up. They, for the first time in 200 years, this cannon's breaking water. 225 years, and getting fresh air. And this is a real good day for these guys. These guys on a good day are looking for cars. On a bad day are looking for guns or something else. And so this was kind of nice for them to get some good publicity for. And we cleaned it up. We took it back. We were able to identify kind of the vintage of it. This is, you can't hardly see it, but it's a George Regis, and they got a 2 in there. There's a couple of Roman numerals, which is George II, which helped us narrow down the timeline. The first thing we did was put it in water so it didn't start rotting. So we got it submerged. We did some research, and there aren't many freshwater cannon. A lot of saltwater cannon. Only one other freshwater cannon out of the Great Lakes that we were able to find. Chemical baseline. I'm learning a lot about chemistry at this point. Did some sample testing, defined a plan, got a budget, had to find some money, found some sources, and we preserved the darn thing. And what was really cool, we did get it on display at the end. And one of the really fun parts was Cranbrook was doing a shipwreck exhibit at the time, and they borrowed it. And they set up and helped us do the electrolysis, which is to pull the salts out of the iron, which over time that would be destroying it. And they pull it out every couple of weeks. You'd have to pull it out to change the water. And when they did that, they'd bring the cannon over and set it on some, gym mats, and give kids a bunch of toothbrushes and let them be archaeologists. It was a blast. And the good part was, one of those kids actually hit it. On the end of this trunnion, there's an H, which you couldn't see until they got in there and started scraping. And the H is Haskell Furnace, which is over in England, and only made cannons for the British Army for 3 years. So we were able to pin down within a 3-year period when this cannon was made, which was and the kids were having fun too. And that's pretty cool. And then we unveiled it in our lobby, and the cops got, again, lots of TV coverage, and it got to be in the spotlight, which was great fun. And they also helped us with this one. Sometimes it's just a phone call. I was at my desk on a typical day, which when students come in and say, so tell me what your typical day is. And I say, there's no such thing as a typical day, and this is typical of my non-typical day. They made a phone call, I'm giving it away here, and the guy one of the divers had been down looking for a car, and he put his hand on an arm, and it was stiff. It wasn't moving. And then he kind of felt around and realized that this was a bronze statue at the foot of Alter Road, just in the water, kind of next to where they didn't find the car, and they got it out, but they found this thing, and so they took a couple of pictures. You can see that their sea arc is kind of tipping over as they're trying to get it up out of the water. They sent me these pictures on their phone, and I got them. Actually, at that time, I didn't have a smartphone. I still had a flip phone, so I had them send to one of my assistants. They downloaded the pictures. We sent these off to a couple people in our organization saying, any idea? Anybody got any thoughts? And oddly enough, the CEO who lived in Grosse Pointe and was on the board at the Grosse Pointe War Memorial, which is the old Alger house over there, said, we used to have a statue like that. It got stolen about 25 years ago. And so he called the people at the War Memorial. They hopped in their car, and by the time they got it down to the Coast Guard station, who had a crane good enough to lift the thing out of the boat, those guys were standing there saying, yep, that's our statue. And so it was a matter of about 35 minutes. Technology can be pretty cool.
Wow.
Now, the downside of this was the insurance company had already paid them for the statue, so they had to go back to the insurance company and settle that up. But the gales of November, they can be pretty tough. The good part is that the boats are no longer sailing into those. They've got the information. They're keeping people safe. They've got the technology to not have to worry about that. Those that have been lost, if you think of even Swayze's number, 4,700 boats. If each of those boats has 10 guys on it, we're talking 47,000 sailors that are down, and we don't know how many were lost on canoes and that kind of thing. So we're talking about a lot of people that have been lost over the eons sailing on our lakes. The best part we can get out of that is taking those wrecks, leaving them on the bottom, and you learn the hard way, and getting the information, any information that's possible, drawing that information out, and there's some wonderful groups around the lakes. The folks at the Wisconsin Historical Society are doing that. There's folks up in northern Michigan, around the Mackinac Straits area, folks in Traverse City, Cleveland, Ontario, Save Ontario Shipwrecks is another organization. There's a lot of people that are trying to make this stuff happen. Chicago Underwater Explorers, a lot of groups are trying to make, get the information while we still can and while these things are available. So, real downside, shipwrecks. That's a bad thing. Upside, shipwrecks can be a wonderful tool. So, that's what I've got. Thank you for listening. I love talking about the Great Lakes. Happy to answer any questions if you got them. Yeah.
The shipwrecks move.
No, sometimes they move. It depends on what they're on and kind of how they went down. They found a wreck just recently, and I saw the shots, and the thing just augured right in, and it's not moving. There was a wreck that I saw a presentation last week on that was over near the Apostle Islands, and because of the currents that run through the islands at various times, and the fact that it was on a little bit of an incline, and it was pretty hard rock with a sand coating, which made it easy for it to just slip. The thing slid a couple of 100 yards. Since they recorded it, so who knows how much it slid since then. Somebody had recovered the boiler from that vessel back 35, 40 years ago, and a group of divers actually said, well, let's go put it back, which was great. It's kind of the counter process. We're putting these things back down there. So they took it out and they put it down and set it down where they thought it was, and they went back the next day to kind of secure it, and it had moved 300 feet down that hill. They had to bring it back up, and then they devised some really cool, cabling for it, so it's not going anywhere. But yeah, they do move. I think most of the ones that go down and sit flat in open water, where they're down far enough that the currents aren't impacted, they're pretty much there.
I have a
Yeah.
That thing that's on Niagara Falls that moved a little bit, what will happen if that, that big thing in Niagara Falls, that 100-year-old? Up on Niagara Falls, there's like some barge up there that's.
Oh, really?
Got
Oh, that they used as like as a break wall or something?
No, it's
It's lodge.
Was it?
Yeah, so what
No, I'm not
happens if
familiar.
because of all the rain, it moved and it hadn't moved for 100 years? What would happen if that big thing went down the falls?
It'd make a bigger wreck? I don't know. I think it would probably, I don't know. I don't know what it's made of. It would
Damage the rocks or
It
the
would
falls? Or
probably not damage the
be
rocks.
stuck there like in the falls?
Could? Sure. How many times have we seen in the cartoons where the canoe gets this far over the precipice and just kind of, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. I'm not aware. That's kind of a funny question. You'll have to, now I always come out to these things and I
Yeah,
go
just a
home with
week or
homework.
so ago, I think.
What did that sole survivor attribute to his ability to survive?
He attributed it to luck and maybe the spirits.
So Bradley,
Yeah.
wasn't there two guys on a raft and one was under the other one?
That's the Bradley, the Morel, and I'm trying to think of the fellow's
Ask about
name.
the Morel.
The Morel had the single survivor, and he was on a raft in his underwear and a pea coat. He originally had 4 guys on the raft, and one by one they lost them. Dennis Hale, that's it. Dennis just died, what, last year, a year ago? Yeah, Dennis, and that was tough, because he had rushed out, he was in his underwear, and a shirt and a life vest and a pea coat. I mean, when they got him, he wasn't comatose, he wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't really conscious. The guys on the other raft, one was the first mate off the Bradley, was the first mate, and then Frank Mays. And I'm not sure, I don't remember what Frank did. Was he one of the steers? I don't recall. Anyway, he survived much better. They weren't in the water that long. That was off of Charlevoix. They got recovered pretty quick. Dennis Hale was in for a while.
Another question, this preserve, this might be silly, the preserve off Whitefish Point, does it go out as far as the Fitzgerald? Because isn't it like 17 miles out?
The Fitzgerald's actually in Canadian water.
So our preserve doesn't reach it, our diving preserve.
No, the Canadians, there have been a couple of expeditions down there, and I think the Canadians have put a real kibosh on that. They're treating it as a grave site. They did, I think, allow somebody to send an ROV down a few years ago, but they're not letting divers down anymore, to my knowledge. So, I know a couple of guys that actually did that dive, that free diving, not in the
It's
summer.
500 feet.
Huh?
Isn't that 500 feet down?
530. Yeah, that's some serious diving. Rick's a crazy guy, but he's not too crazy. So I don't think he's a pretty good. If you ever see any videos by Rick Mixter, Rick does stuff about shipwrecks, and he also does stuff about aviation. Great Lakes videographer. He does some fun stuff. So if you see Rick's stuff, R-I-C and then Mixter. So. Well, good. Thanks for coming out. Oh, you had one more question? Yeah.
Just the other night, your Lost Mariners Remembrance was online, and I
It
watched
was.
it at home.
Oh, good.
Is that still available? Is it?
I don't know. I'd have to ask Neil Schulteis about that.
Okay.
I think it should be available, or if it's not, it will be soon. Usually he goes back and picks it up, and then we'll rebroadcast and make it a permanent thing.
Oh, it's very interesting.
Yeah, we've been webcasting that for probably the last 10 years. Thanks to MSU Management Education Center in Troy. I should just throw that in, just because they do let us use their equipment for nothing. And Neil's a wonderful guy. Neil is one of those great volunteers. There's a webcam at the Dawson. There's a webcam at what they call Vantage Point in Port Huron. And he runs both of those things and completely volunteer. He also drives the Westcott 2, the mailboat. So he's a skipper, and he's also this year happens to be president of the International Shipmasters Association Lodge 7 Detroit. So Neil's a real good guy, and that's not even his day job. His day job is doing tech up at the Education Center. So great guy. Well, thanks. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Hopefully see some of you in December. Thanks.